Good morning, everybody. This is Tristen Yancey with Keeper Security. We are the next ones up. So I am going to share my screen here and we can get going. Okay, so I have about 7 slides of content just to give you an overview of Keeper Security, who we are, what we do. And I myself am the Vice President of Public Sector for Keeper Security. I also have Mitch Rosen on the line. He's our Global Director of Solutions Engineering, and he will be giving the technical portion and how it applies to the 12 scenarios that ATARC has lined up. So to get started, we've been around for 11 years. This is not a new industry to us. What we do is credentials and secrets management. So end user as well as machine password management. The great thing is we're the most secure out there. So our biggest claim to fame right now is that we are FedRAMP in process. We received our ATO last week, and we are looking to become fully authorized by the end of May, beginning of June. And so we are the only enterprise password management solution on the FedRAMP marketplace, and will continue to be so for some time. In addition to FedRAMP, we are also FIPS 140-2, SOC 2, and ISO 27001. The applicability to this group is we are 100% zero trust, zero knowledge. So we do not hold the end user credentials at any point. That is held by the end user on their devices. And Mitch is going to get into that more as he steps through the technical portion of our presentation. So not sure if many of you are aware, but 81% of breaches are actually due to weak password security and related controls, and a staggering number of 20 billion number of stolen login credentials are out on the dark web. So when I first joined Keeper Security, I found those statistics to be very interesting. Needless to say, it highlights a weakness in either government or the commercial enterprise. So what are the primary threat vectors for the government? It's definitely dark web and phishing. So credential stuffing attacks that result in account takeover and the introduction of ransomware. So how do we try and combat that? And there is no one single bullet, right? If you look at the solutions on the right-hand side, you need a mix of these because there is not one that does it all. So we obviously partner with a lot of these potential solutions to give you a robust and rounded out solution overall to attack those security weaknesses. Core problems, it really does come down to visibility, right? Visibility over password security and hygiene, visibility over dark web activity. And, you know, everybody has a hard time trying to protect all of the endpoints, credentials, and secrets in their environment. So what we do is we take control and help provide that visibility to you, all in a zero trust and zero knowledge architecture. We integrate and provision quickly with a number of technologies, whether it be Azure, Active Directory. I'm not going to read them all to you. You can see them there. And at the end of the day, we really do improve employee and user productivity. So rather than having everybody look around for all of their passwords, try and identify where they are, log them in, you get a single password that unlocks your vault and gives you access to all of your applications, your websites. You can store things such as certificates in your vault as well. It really does open up your world in terms of productivity. So the great thing about Keeper is that we do work on any device, whether it be private or multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, on-premise or co-location. Additionally, we integrate with all major identity providers. So you can see the major players on this as well. The one thing I did want to point out is that single sign-on does not solve all of the security and productivity issues with passwords. So they're great for SAML compliant applications, but what about your non-SAML compliant applications? What about your offline secure access? What about looking at client-side encryption? So we really do fill in a gap. We work with those single sign-on vendors to make them better, to give you a more robust security posture. So just something to keep in mind. And with that, we are at the end of the PowerPoint presentation. Just wanted to give you a quick high-level overview. Before we step into the technical portion, are there any questions? Okay, with that, Mitch, I am going to turn it over to you. And Mitch, if you're talking, we cannot hear you.
Yeah, you gotta love that mute button. Appreciate it. Thanks, Tristen, for handing it over. I should be sharing my screen out, so if technology doesn't fail us, you should be looking at the keepersecurity.com homepage. And while this is going to be probably more of a presentation, if anyone does have any questions, I do not mind if you interrupt me and ask me them, and we can kind of dive down in whatever areas that you want. Typically, the way I like to handle this discussion is kind of talking about our administrative consoles and some of the enforcement settings that can be applied with regards to the implementation of a secure password managing solution. And then I'd like to, as I'm kind of going through, what it looks like to deploy and to get it configured through enforcement settings, I kind of show what the end user sees as well, right? Kind of a, hey, this is what you do in the console, and this is what happens, and what the end user sees. And hopefully you'll get a good picture as to what our solution can do for your organizations in terms of ensuring that they maintain a zero knowledge solution with regards to their identity and access management. And really, I believe that zero trust begins with password security. Our products are using a zero trust security framework. It's based not on trusting any user within the architecture. And so, that zero trust assumes that all your users and devices could potentially be compromised, and thus each user has to be verified and authenticated before they can access a website, application, or system. In fact, I'd like to, before I jump into the solution, just talk a little bit about our security model, especially when we're talking about the keys of the kingdom and what organizations, are looking for with regards to that sort of protection. So here I have our administrative portal. One of the first things you'll notice is we're pretty fanatical about making sure our customers and organizations that use our product have all the information necessary in order to fully understand how to deploy it, how to use it from an end user standpoint. So we have end user guides, the administrator guides. As Tristen mentioned, we do integrate with any SAML 2.0 identity provider. And while we don't necessarily look at us competing with single sign-on, we look at it as more of a complementary item, right? Single sign-on is incredibly convenient. Users only have one identity, and as long as other solutions can integrate with that single sign-on platform, then it makes it very seamless and easy to use. The challenge, however, with single sign-on is not every single sign-on, or I should say not every application integrates with single sign-on, and so consequently, passwords are still being used. And when passwords are used, where do they get stored? To where they're secure, they're protecting the personal persona of that account they're logging into. And when you think about password management, it's not just an IT issue, or it's not just a DevOps issue. It is a organizational issue, right? Every single user has an identity that they need to protect, and single sign-on just protects one of those identities. It doesn't do very well in protecting it when that identity has different authentication methods outside of that SAML 2.0. So we can integrate with that single sign-on and kind of bring the best of both worlds together. We also have our Keeper Commander. This is our CLI SDK capabilities, so that anyone that doesn't want to use a GUI-based utility for more programmatic, implementation and use cases, have that ability. Tristen did mention that we have a secrets manager capability as well, so removing hard-coded credentials out of applications and CI/CD processes, so that if you did have a malicious user, make their way into your network, if they got a hold of any source code, or if they looked at your build processes, they would not find a hard-coded credential in there, right? Because that would be provisioned on demand through the integration with Keeper Secrets Manager. We also have a Keeper Connection Manager. This gives you session recording and the ability to allow users to RDP or SSH or open a console to a database, or use VNC without having to deploy any agents and without having to install any software on the user's computer in order to gain access, right? Just uses a standard web page. They never get access to the password. It's all proxied through the Keeper connection manager server, and those can be recorded as well. I've kind of diverted a little bit there, but the main point here was I was coming to our security and encryption model just to talk about how Keeper has implemented a zero trust and zero knowledge solution. And of course, you know, at this point in time, everyone's probably pretty familiar with the term zero trust, right? It's no longer a buzzword. It's actually something tangible with you know, qualities that you're trying to esteem for. And really what gives us our zero trust capabilities is our zero knowledge architecture. And what that means, you know, in layman's terms, is that all the encryption and decryption occurs locally. At no point does anybody's data ever leave the confines of their device and transmit to our backend. Now, while Keeper is a SaaS solution, that primarily means that we're maintaining high availability and redundancy so that your data is always protected. But as a zero knowledge solution, we never actually have access to your data, right? So it's only the ciphertext that ever synchronizes into our secure cloud. And so when a user can successfully authenticate, whether that be natively with a master password or through a SAML process, you know, leveraging an identity through an identity provider, they have to securely authenticate, and then that authentication allows them to bring down the encrypted binary of their data, and then they can decrypt it locally, either with a master password or by leveraging single sign-on and utilizing our technology, which essentially is an elliptical curve that protects that data on a per device basis. And we can get a little more in detail on that. As Tristen mentioned, right, we are the only solution for enterprise password management that has a SOC 2 and ISO 27001 certification. We actually have the longest standing SOC 2 and ISO in the industry. We also maintain a privacy shield. We maintain GDPR for our European customers as well. And you know, as Tristen mentioned too, we're the only solution that's currently on the FedRAMP marketplace, right? We're currently in process. That ATO should be signed here very shortly. And with that, right, we are the only solution that has that FIPS 142 validation, right? And we have on our site our certificate there. The great thing is, while we did that for our FedRAMP environment, any of our customers on any of our data centers gets those same algorithms that have been certified. Another claim to fame that we have that really kind of exceeds what other solutions are doing is we do record level encryption. And what that means is, inside your vault, every single record that's created has its own unique AES-256-bit encryption key. And when I use the term a record is indicative of a password or a secret or a credential or a file or any sort of data that you place inside of your vault, ultimately goes into a record, and that record has its own unique key. So if you were to have, let's say, 10,000 records in your vault, you would have 10,000 unique AES-256-bit keys protecting each of those individual records. And so the great news is, when you go to share a record with another user, we do leverage PKI using elliptical curve cryptography, so that you actually are going to grab their public key. You're going to encrypt the key of the record that you're sharing with them with their public key. That gets shared to them. Their private key unwraps it, thus giving them the key to the record you've shared, now allowing them to decrypt that record and gaining access to the data that's inside that record. Again, typically a password or credential or secret of some sort, but it could be a file or any other sort of data that's contained in there. I could go in a lot further in detail with our encryption model, right? Both through a master password natively or via single sign-on. But rather than spending the time in doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the admin console. And if we do have any questions regarding our cryptography and regarding our encryption model, I'm happy to jump back in that if so desired. So to get back to the admin console, I'm just going to go to our Keeper website, and I'm going to go ahead and select the admin console. And just as a point of clarification, only those users that have been granted administrative permissions will have the ability to log into the admin console. every single user that gets onboarded to an organization's tenant will have their own web vault. And within that web vault, because we're zero knowledge, zero trust, every single credential that they create will only be accessible by that user unless they implicitly share it to another user or to via a shared folder to another user or to a team. We'll talk more about that. So every user will have their own vault, but only those users that have been granted administrative access will be able to log into the admin console. So I'm going to go ahead and log into the admin console. And I'm going to do this natively with a master password. If you do have single sign-on configured, you can access the admin console through that identity. And it would just be the same process. Rather, you'd have a signed attestation from your identity provider, or if you don't, then it's going to route you through to authenticate through that IDP. Now, when I first log in, you're going to notice something that's kind of unique to Keeper. Once the email address is in there, if I have two factors set up, it's going to prompt me for my second factor first. So before I'm even given the opportunity to inject the master password in, I'm going to have to satisfy the two-factor requirement that's been placed on this account. Now, I do have a UB key used, a security key used for that authentication. And so once I've satisfied that by tapping the key in my computer, now I'm given the opportunity to put in the master password. And this does a couple of things for our customers. Number one, it prevents any sort of brute force access, right? Where that second factor has to be met before you're given the opportunity to put in the first factor, right? The master password. Secondly, by not giving them the ability to do so, it prevents a malicious user from trying to throttle an account by putting in just failed attempts and causing this account not to be able to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the master password. And of course, because I'm not used to typing in passwords, hopefully I did not fat finger that. Once I've successfully authenticated, you can see it brought me into the Keeper admin console. Here we have a dashboard that shows me what the top events are. This just gives a quick visibility in terms of what are the most common events that are happening within the organization. Probably for most organizations, it's the authenticating to the solution and utilizing, a record, right? Opening a record for the passing in of a credential on a website, or opening it up to grab the password to log into an application. We'll talk more about the events and what our logging looks like, because it is very robust and incredibly powerful for administrators to know what's going on within their organization. The other key features you'll see here on the admin console is you'll get a quick visibility of the security audit. This shows you where your organization stands with regards to how your users are doing with their password hygiene, and we'll talk more about that in depth. And then you'll also see you get a quick score too regarding Breachwatch. Now, Breachwatch is our dark web monitoring service that allows you and your users to see if any of the credentials in their vault have been found on the dark web. And we'll touch base in that a little more in depth as well. So I'm going to go ahead and navigate over here to this admin section. And this is where all the configuration occurs within the environment. This section here is what we call the node section. It's synonymous to like little organizational units, if you're familiar with Active Directory. In fact, when we do integrate with Active Directory, as I have here, the organizational units will come over as nodes, and wherever the users reside inside of those OUs, they're going to reside inside of a corresponding node within Keeper. And the way we're able to do this synchronization is this is setting up a provisioning method using an LDAP sync. And what that means is you'll have a lightweight application that gets installed on a member server in your environment and allows you to synchronize your users over for the purpose of provisioning them using simple LDAP query statements. And along with that, you can leverage security groups to define users to be in roles and or teams. And I'll talk a little more in depth on what roles and teams are. In addition to being able to provision and deprovision users via Active Directory, as we've mentioned, we do have the ability to integrate with single sign-on. And as you can see here, I have a node called SSO Connect Cloud Node. And in here, I have integrated multiple identity providers that can be leveraged. Now, one of the neat things about our implementation is we don't lock an organization into one single identity provider. We recognize that while an organization may be using Azure today, they may be looking at Okta tomorrow or looking at some other solution. And so rather than trying it out and messing up everybody, right, you can have multiple IDPs configured, and just basically wherever the user exists in the node structure is going to be the identity provider that's tied to them. So these users are tied to Okta, and these users are tied to Azure, right? So all those can be done, it's configured simultaneously. I could log into either of those users and it would route me to their appropriate identity provider. And upon successful authentication, that user would be able to decrypt their vault and gain access to that. We have the concept of roles and teams. And I should point out too, with users, right? Even if you decide not to integrate with Active Directory, or you decide not to integrate with an identity provider, you still have the tried and true means of putting in the user's name, email address, job title, click add. It'll send them an email. They can click on that and they can get registered, right? And you can do multiple users using a CSV, right? So that's kind of the lower tech integration method that's supported as well. And again, you can use a combination of anything there within. So we have the concept of roles and teams, right? And this is very unique to Keeper. A role really does two things for us. A role allows you to configure enforcement settings for your users, and it's also where you're able to extend administrative permissions within our solution. In fact, on day one, when an organization starts up their Keeper tenant, the only role that they have configured is the Keeper administrator role, right? The very first user that gets onboarded, right, the one that creates the trial, is placed into that administrator, that Keeper administrator position. And as you'll notice on this role, as I scroll down here, it has administrative permissions configured. And when you click on that, you'll see that all these permissions are default out of the box. The only thing not on day one is the account transfer, and I'll talk more about that here in a second. But so the Keeper administrator has the ability to manage the nodes, right? They can invite the users, they can set up the roles and define the teams. They can run security reports and set up the integration for single sign-on and Active Directory. They're able to do device approvals. They're able to manage the different record types inside of Keeper, and they're able to run compliance reports. Right? And again, the only thing not on day one is the ability to transfer the account of another user. Now, again, we're a zero trust, zero knowledge solution, which means if an organization wants the capability to be able to transfer the content of a user's vault to another user in an emergent situation, as a break glass means, they have to enable it here with the Keeper administrator first before they actually do it. Many organizations decide that they don't want that capability, right? Whatever gets in a user's vault is only going to be allowed to be accessed by that user. Other organizations treat their corporate vaults a little more like they do their corporate email, right? And that is, there's no intended privacy in your corporate email. And so they could go in at any time, right? So this account transfer doesn't give snoop capability, right? As an administrator and Keeper, you can't just snoop into a user's vault to grab a credential out of there. But in an emergent situation with the account transfer set up, you could in fact take over the contents of that user's vault and allow the organization to continue operating it, right? For example, Tristen wins the lottery, decides she's never coming back to work again, and she's going to sip Mai Tais on the beach. By having her account in that account transfer, if she had a credential in there, if she had an identity in there that's necessary for the organization to continue to operate, rather than having to wait for her to log back in and transfer it, which she's not because she's on the beach, you'd be able to lock her account out and transfer all the records to another user, whether it be a colleague, whether it be her manager, or whether it be the administrator. And that just gives organizations a little more control and a little more protection in the data that gets placed in there without the compromise of it being a zero trust. So that's the administrative permission. The other half of what a role does is enforcement policies. And on this particular role, I'm not leveraging any of the enforcement policies. Instead, what I typically recommend for organizations is to create a default user role. And you'll notice on this default user role, we have not set up any administrative permission, which means any user that gets onboarded and placed into this default user role does not grant them access to the admin console, which means they do not have the ability to configure any of the enforcement settings or any of the roles, teams, and everything else here. But what it is going to do is it's going to apply enforcement policies, AKA the rules in which their vaults are governed under. And typically I recommend too checking this box, which allows you to set the role as default. So anytime I onboard a user, whether that be manually through Active Directory Bridge, through single sign-on integration, right, either via SCIM or via a just-in-time provisioning, they're going to be placed inside of this role, and they're going to automatically take on all the enforcement policies that are configured here. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into each and every policy that we have, but I will touch upon a few that I think are important and interesting. So one of the things that we get asked about, especially when an organization is looking at integrating with single sign-on, is what do you do when the identity provider is not available, either because they're down or the internet's down? Which is a great question. What do you do? Right? As we all know, single sign-on is an online authentication protocol. So if you're not online or if the identity provider can't vouch for your identity, it means anything that's trusted with that identity is not going to be able to be validated at that time, which is why we've come up with the enforcement setting to allow a user to circumvent single sign-on by having the ability to create a master password. That master password can be used primarily, the primary use case there is in an offline scenario, right? A master password can be used to generate the encryption key that allows the user to decrypt their vault and gain access to their data key. It's that data key which allows them to decrypt their record keys, gives them access to their team keys and their role keys and all the different keys associated with it. So typically I'd advise an organization not necessarily to deploy that organizational wide, but if there are key personnel that absolutely need to be able to gain access to their vault, to gain access to the records that are in there, having that master password will be able to give them the ability in an offline situation or in a situation where the identity provider cannot validate their identity to still be able to get into their keeper vault. This would typically be with an IT person who maybe needs to gain access to the passwords, to gain access to the infrastructure, to figure out why the internet's down, or maybe it's a C-level exec or somebody that based on their role, regardless, always needs access to their data. If you're going to implement a master password, you obviously have control in the complexity of that and when it periodically rotates. We do always recommend, especially with organizations that are leveraging a master password, to enforce two-factor authentication. Organizations that are using single sign-on, it's a little more up in the air as to whether or not they choose to integrate two-factor with Keeper. And what I mean by that is more often than not, hopefully all the time, but I'm not going to speak for every organization, when single sign-on is in play, whenever the user authenticates their identity, typically there's a two-factor involved in that authentication piece. So in order for the user to vouch for their identity, they've already authenticated with a password and a two-factor. So now that their identity is validated, right, and they can log into a service provider like Keeper, they have the ability now to gain access to their vault. For a lot of organizations, that's all the resistance and friction that they want in gaining access to it. Other organizations, because their identity is kind of always open, right? They log in when they log into their computer, and then for the next 8 hours of their day, right, the identity is always kind of validated. To prevent someone from going behind them, right, when they get up real quick to go to the copier and they didn't lock out their computer, having two factors set up in Keeper just provides one extra layer of protection at the application layer. So many organizations will choose to require their users to also have it set up here. It's up to you. We don't mandate it. We just give you the option to have it. So what type of two factors do we have available? Well, we integrate with SMS text. We'll integrate with any sort of TOTP application, whether that be Google Authenticator, Microsoft Authenticator, Authy, right? The list goes on different TOTP solutions. We also have a smartwatch integration. So if you have a iOS or an Android watch, we have an integration there. And then for many organizations that have a subscription with RSA Secure ID or Duo Security, we have integrations with those as well. You have the ability to choose what platforms your users can leverage. By default, every option is available, and a user can gain access to their Keeper web vault or their Keeper vault from the web, either directly through the website or using a browser extension. They have the ability to access their vault through a mobile device. And again, we support all the major mobile devices, and our applications are on the stores there. We also have a desktop app as well, which is about 95% synonymous with the web vault, but there is an additional capability there with regards to native applications. And then we also have, as I mentioned before, our command line interface, right? Keeper Commander. This gives people who are a little more inclined of using a CLI versus a GUI the ability to access their vault. And of course, from a role perspective, you can choose where your users can access their vaults from and where not to. I should point out, since you see it here, Keeper Chat, we also do have a chat application. Many organizations add that on to their subscription, and they can deploy that to their users through this enforcement as well. Again, I won't go through all the Vault features, but this section here allows you to kind of control how the Vault responds, whether certain fields are masked by default, whether you require additional authentication for autofilling passwords or revealing a password. Inside the Vault, when a user deletes something, it actually doesn't delete, right? And this is a good segue to kind of launch the Vault so you can see what that looks like. So I'm just going to go ahead, and I'm just launching it through the browser extension. Since I'm already authenticated, I just click on the data vault, and it'll go ahead and launch me into that vault. And so, like I was mentioning, when a user goes to delete an application, it doesn't get deleted permanently. Instead, it goes into the deleted bin, right? This is designed because sometimes a user will inadvertently delete the wrong record that they wanted to, right? The mouse slips, they're not paying attention, they remove something that they hadn't. If we permanently deleted it at that time, it would cause some challenges for the end user. So instead, it goes into this nice safety net. And from here, they can either choose to restore the credential and bring it back in, or they can go ahead and empty the trash. Now, to prevent that rogue user who says, all right, I'm leaving the organization tomorrow, so today I'm going to go ahead and purge everything out of my vault, and I'm smart enough to know that it's not really purged, it's just sitting in the deleted bin, but because I want to wreak havoc, I'm going to go ahead and empty the trash and delete everything there. And that way, when you choose to transfer my account to somebody else, they're not going to be there. This is where the enforcement setting comes in to prevent users from permanently clearing their trash bin for X number of days. And so in that particular case, the user wouldn't be able to purge out their trash bin because it has not resided in there for more, in this case, than 120 days is what I have configured. And so the user would get locked out, and when they get transferred, everything in the vault and anything in the trash bin would get transferred to whoever you select that transfer occur. Just prevents those sort of rogue actions and ensures the organization can continue having access to the data that it potentially needs. The other cool thing you can do here in the Vault features is you can set up password complexity. You can do that on a per domain basis, or you can use wildcards. Just gives you a little more control in terms of what type of complexity rules are desired with maybe a specific site or a specific domain that gets stored inside of the Vault. I made mention of record types, right? So by default, Keeper has access to over 19 different record types. And what that means is when a user goes to create a record in their Vault, there'll be the ability to choose any one of these different 19 templates to be able to create that from. Everything from your standard login to just storing a file, or maybe it's a photo, putting in a database credential or server credential. And again, I won't go through all these, but you'll have that ability. Now that in of itself is pretty neat, and that's more options than most solutions have. But the really cool part is you get also the ability to create custom record types. And so one of the admin permissions is to be able to create record types. And so anyone that has that permission will be able to create a record type, and those can get deployed on a per role basis. So let's say your IT team creates one specifically for their use, but they don't want it deployed to the HR team or to the marketing team, right? You can have different roles, and you can determine based on the role the user's in what templates they have access to. The other thing that gets pointed out oftentimes is maybe you don't want PII stored inside their vault. And while everything is encrypted, you know, you're not necessarily as concerned that the data inside the vault is ever going to get compromised, but rather at the time of transfer, right, where you would transfer a user and they have PII in there, and now it goes to someone that shouldn't have it. So you can turn off all the templates that are related to PII inside the role basis. And so anyone, and let me just cancel out here. So anyone that has that record type permission will be able to go in here and create a new record type. And so they can go ahead and generate those record types from any of the existing record types that we have, or they can go ahead and create one directly from a blank slate. And they'll just choose what fields they want to have in there. So in this case, I'm going to choose a security question and answer. I'm going to allow you to store a file or photo in there. I'm going to allow you to set up a two-factor code as well, a URL, the password, and the login. And of course, you can also change the workflow, right? If we want to say, all right, well, I don't want the files to be the first thing before you answer your security question and answer, or before you set up your two-factor. So this is the order I want. These are the required fields that I'm going to mandate in this record before you can save it. And then you'll see here on the password field, right, there's some additional settings that you can opt in at. One of those being enacting the privacy screen, which means once the password's in there, you're not going to visually be able to see it again. And you'll primarily be able to use that with the browser extension to fulfill it in. You can also require that your users have to randomly generate the password, and they can't just type it in. This is primarily on new account creations. It's designed so someone wouldn't, be more inclined to put in a weaker password than just to mandate that they randomly generate it with a secure, complex capability there. And you can set the password complexity here at the record type level. So anytime you use this record type, it's going to be indicative of having to meet a password complexity rule. Once those are all set, you can go ahead and publish it. You'll see the list of published customized records. And of course, I'm going to discard that. And of course, within the role itself, right, you'll have the ability to deploy those to your users. So it gives organizations a lot of capabilities with regards to how their vaults are organized and what sort of data they're leading their users to store in there. You also have the ability to control where information is shared from, right? Not every organization has the use case to share credentials amongst their users. So again, this can be controlled on a per role basis. Typically, I'll see organizations turn off sharing outside of their enterprise. So anyone that's not part of your organization will not be able to, your users won't be able to share to them outside. Anyone that's part of the organization would be allowed to share. Unless, of course, you select the enforcement setting here to prevent sharing. Keeper Fill, again, that's our browser plugin that gives a lot of convenience and security with regards to auto-filling credentials for websites. There are a lot of settings that can be configured there, and this gives you kind of a little more of a programmatic way of enforcing those settings to your users. Account settings, again, I won't go through all these, but when you onboard users, you can have those invitations continually remind the user to set up their vault, right? Oftentimes the user will receive the invite. Their intention is to create the vault, but it just gets lower in the priority list and gets further down in their email queue to eventually where they don't see it again. Obviously, if everyone's using a password manager, then your organizational security is improved. And so you want to be able to onboard your users. So you can set up a reminder periodically so that they'll get re-reminded to set that up, because I'm sure everybody was planning on doing it. You also have the ability to set an IP address whitelist. This just ensures that your data only goes to where you want it to go, right? And even though it's encrypted, and even though you have two-factor set up and protections, oftentimes you don't want a user to access their work vault at their home location. And so that would require them to either VPN in or to only be able to access it from their local network, right? Being able to be inside your organization. I've made mention of our ability to deploy Keeper Secrets Manager, right, to remove hard-coded credentials in applications and CI/CD processes. It's not a one-to-one ratio, right? So if you license, let's say, 1,000 users in your organization to have Keeper as a password managing solution, does not mean you need 1,000 licenses to deploy Keeper Secrets Manager to your developers and your DevOps people, right? So the way you can kind of control, if you, let's say, only purchase 100 licenses, is you can set a role and you can turn that on, and those users will have access to that license. And of course, I made mention earlier on about the account transfer, right? This gives you that break glass means. Once the Keeper administrator has the permission to do it, the second part of configuring that is ensuring who they can perform the transfer on. So that is a role enforcement. The user has to be in a role that has the account transfer enabled, and then you select which role has the permission to transfer those users. And so the user will get popped up with a message stating that they have 7 days to comply. Basically, they have to agree to it. That way, if they did put anything personal in there that they didn't want transferred, they have the option to remove it. Once they accept it, now the Keeper administrator has the key, which allows them to be able to decrypt the vault later on upon that account transfer. Does not give them the ability to just log in as that user and see what's going on. It does allow them to transfer their data and send it to another user after they've locked the account out, and only if the user's in the account transfer or in a role with account transfer permissions set. So those are the role enforcements. Again, it gives you administrative permissions and allows you to set the enforcement policies, aka the rules. The other concept we have is teams. Teams are essentially a collection of users for the purpose of sharing. And so a great use case in that is, let's say, a social media team or a technical team that needs access to shared resources. And so you're able to create a grouping of users, either via the SCIM process where you leverage an Azure group or an Okta group, or you can leverage that through the Active Directory sync where you leverage a security group to define the team. Once that team's created, anyone that's in there will gain access to a shared folder inside the vault. So for example, I have one called the social media user team. Now this was one I manually created. Anyone now that's part of this team will be able to gain access to any shared folder that's shared to this. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to single sign on in with a user. I'm going to leverage Azure, and of course I could leverage any of our other solutions, but I'm already authenticated here. And so I'm going to go ahead and initiate an IDP login. And the reason I'm highlighting an IDP login is not every solution that integrates with SAML supports an IDP initiated login, right? Most of them, if they do support a SAML authentication, will support a service provider login, meaning you always have to go to the vendor site to initiate the login. With our implementation, you can initiate it from the identity provider. So I'm clicking on the vault, and the user that I'm logging in as is Jan. Jan's going to go ahead and be prompted for two-factor because we did enable that in her role. Once she has met the security key there, now she has access to her website. You'll notice that she didn't need to have a separate master password to decrypt her data, simply authenticating against the IDP. It's protected on this device using elliptical curve cryptography so that when this device goes to log in, Keeper will see that her assigned attestation has occurred. It's going to go ahead and send her her data key. It's wrapped by this device's public key. Once it gets sent to the application, this application will use its private key. It'll unwrap it, thus allowing the user to decrypt their vault contents and gain access to that. So you'll see here in Jan's vault, she has a few folders set up, and the little folder with the share mark is a shared folder. That shared folder is indicative of meaning that it has its own encryption key associated with it. And that encryption key is protecting the encryption keys of the records that are tied to it. Now she has a few that she's created, but what we're going to do is we're going to add her to the social media team and give her access to a social media folder. So notice in Jan's vault, right? This is the user I'm using, Jan. She does not have a shared folder called social media. Now inside of Michael Scott's vault, I'm going to go to his vault here. We'll do a search for the social media folder. Right, you can see here Michael Scott has created the shared folder. And in this shared folder, he has linked several different records: the Twitter account, Facebook account, Instagram, LinkedIn account, and some test account that he has. All these records that are linked here, again, their specific keys have been shared to the social media folder, and anyone who's been added to this shared folder has access to the keys of these specific records. Now, right now, Michael Scott created it, so he has all the permissions on the shared folder, which means he can manage users, meaning he can add users and or teams to the shared folder, and he can manage records, meaning he can add and remove records to this shared folder. Now, he hasn't invited any individual users. The only other entity is the social media team that's created here inside of the admin console. So we're going to go ahead and manually add Jan to that. And I wanted to point out too, there are additional enforcement settings that we can apply to this team, which prevents them from being able to view the password because we're applying the privacy screen, prevents them from being able to edit the records or reshare it, regardless of the permissions that's set with inside of the actual shared folder. So in this case, everything has share and edit permission except for the Facebook account, which means if I add an individual, they'll be able to edit and share these specific records. But because we've added a team and that team has additional enforcement, the users that are gaining access via team will not have that capability. So we're going to go ahead and add Jan to this, and I'm just going to do a quick search for Jan's account. We'll go ahead and select her. And the second that I add her to that, she's going to get pushed access to that vault data. And in fact, I'm going to go as fast as I can just so you can see it pop up. But 9 times out of 10, it's already there by the time I navigate back to it. So I'm going to go ahead and click add here. I'm going to go back to that account. And as you can see, we didn't get to see it pop up. It's already been pushed out there. So that's how fast our push technology is to ensure that once a user is added to a team or once you modify a record, the data replicates to everyone that is shared with that instantaneously. So now Jan has access to these records. Right? If she goes to the Instagram account, you'll see that that privacy screen is enacted. She does not have the eye to view it. She doesn't have the ability to copy it. This particular account does have a 2-factor code associated with it. Primarily what we're allowing her to do is be able to leverage the browser extension to use it. And so we can go ahead and click on this link and launch Instagram, and the browser extension will fill it in. We could just type in Instagram directly here. But I'm going to go ahead and just show off the browser extension here. I'll do a quick search for that Instagram account. So oftentimes users don't even need to launch their vault. They just will go directly to the browser extension, search what they're looking for, click the fill button. It'll take them to the site, put in the username, the password. It'll also go ahead and put in the 2-factor code that's associated with the record. And now the user now has access to that site, and they can go ahead and continue on and do what they need. You'll notice that they didn't need to see the password. They didn't have access to the password. They didn't need to call somebody else who had the 2-factor on their phone. All that was securely shared inside that record. And again, we're doing record level encryption. So that record is encrypted by its own AES 256-bit encryption key. The only reason Jan had access to that is because she was added to the social media team. That social media team had access to that folder, and that folder had the key to that specific record. So we're going to do things in reverse, right? We're going to go ahead and remove access for Jan. So just as fast as we gave it to her, we're going to go ahead and revoke it. And so we're going to go ahead and remove her from that. Again, I navigate back to her vault. You'll see she no longer has access to that shared folder. Right, so we've revoked access. She no longer has the keys, which means she can never decrypt that data again. And so that's the capability of the teams, again, for the purpose of sharing records out via a shared folder. Just to kind of continue on, right, I talked a little bit at the beginning about the security audit score. So every single user that you onboard with their vault will have their own score associated with them. And so in the case here of looking at Michael Scott's vault, right inside here, he has the ability to look at his security audit. He'll be able to see how many reused credentials he has in his vault and how many weak credentials in a vault. Obviously, the more weak credentials you have, the more at risk you are, the lower your security audit score is going to be. Now, while we're zero knowledge and the specifics of the data of these do not get relayed back to the admins, you will be able to see how users are performed, right? So it does share back the metrics to the administrative console. And so we can kind of see what scores our users have based on their record strength and based on whether or not they're reusing credentials. Obviously, if it's a weak credential, it's easily brute forced. If it's a reused credential, if it's compromised in one spot, it can get compromised elsewhere. And so each user can go ahead and improve their security, and administrators can kind of use this to gauge who they need to have additional training with to improve their password hygiene. So all these scores will tally back up, and it'll go ahead and give the overall score for the organization. And while I always like to say this isn't a silver bullet, it does give you kind of a metric to improve upon, right? That which gets measured gets improved. The higher your security audit score is, the lower your risk is. And of course, that's the name of the game in security, is reducing risk. The other similar sort of viewpoint you get is whether or not your users are using breach credentials. And so the way this works, again, every user inside their vault that you've deployed Breachwatch to will have the ability to see whether or not their credentials have been found on the dark web. So consequently, something that might look complex, if it's found on the dark web, it's going to be flagged. Now, again, I want to highlight the fact that as a zero trust, zero knowledge solution, we never have access to your passwords. The way we accomplish this is when a user creates a vault record and they put in the password, it's going to go ahead and run a hashing algorithm on that. Right, we're going to use an HMAC SHA 512 hashing algorithm, and it's going to go ahead and convert that password to a hash. It's going to send it via an anonymizer to our Breachwatch servers, right? So we don't know who's sending us the hash. Once it arrives on the Breachwatch servers, it gets placed on an HSM. That HSM is peppered where we can extract the data off, and it's hashed with that same algorithm a second time. So now that password has been double hashed and is sitting on an HSM. We do the same thing with the data that we get through our dark web partner. It's double hashed, it's placed on into HSM, and now we're going to go ahead and start comparing what our customers have submitted in terms of hashes versus the hashes that are found on the dark web. And when an exact match is found, it gets flagged in Breachwatch. And when users log back in and check back in to see if anything they've submitted has been matched, they'll either be passed or it'll be flagged as being high risk, meaning, this particular password has been found on the dark web. Now, we're not necessarily saying this particular site has had a breach. What we're saying is the password associated with this account has been breached. And even if it wasn't this account, it's still susceptible to a password stuffing attack, meaning it's much easier for a malicious user to try and brute force with known passwords than it is for them to randomly generate their own passwords. And so we would recommend that the user resolve it. Basically, resolving it means changing your password to something not found on the dark web. So again, all these metrics relay back up to the admin console. You'll be able to see in a moment's class who's got breach credentials in their vault. And again, that gives you pause for having a little more of a focused conversation with those users in terms of how to rectify that. Right, you'll be able to see if users are resolving the issues or whether or not they're ignoring them. And maybe even more of a conversation than just having one is, why are you ignoring that you have one? So those are two great visibilities into your organizational security. The other thing I want to kind of highlight is our reporting and alerts mechanism. As I mentioned at the onset, Keeper has a very robust capability of knowing what's going on without compromising any of the knowledge. So all of our reporting mechanisms are zero knowledge in nature, meaning none of your data ever goes into the reports, right? Again, every ounce of data that's in a record is encrypted with its own key. And because of that, the administrators just don't have capability of knowing what's in there. So with that, though, you can still track events and know what's going on within the organization. So there are three key components that come with the advanced reporting and alerts. Number one is the reporting, which gives you greater visibility into the events that are happening. That'll give you access to view over 150 different event types. You can filter that on a specific user. You can filter it on a specific event type. You can even correlate that with a specific record, right, using a specific attribute. So every single record that gets placed in the vault has a unique identifier associated with it. So if we go back here to the vault, right? And I look at this Instagram account that we looked at earlier, right? We can click here on the information and we'll see that it has its own unique record type. If I click here, it'll actually copy the record type, right? And I can go ahead and paste that into the search bar and do search and it'll find the account. Or I can go ahead and click on the link button and that'll copy a deep link to this specific record. So if I bring that up in a browser and paste that link in, it'll take me directly to that record. Now, only those users that have been shared with have access to it, and they are the only ones that have the key to be able to decrypt it, but it's a great way of disseminating a specific record in documentation or over a chat or in an email without divulging any of the information associated with inside of the record. And so every record has a UID. That UID is visible from within Keeper, but the data inside of that record is not. So here we can correlate when items happen based on the UIDs that it happens. And so as you can see here, right, on today's date and time, Jan went ahead and used the browser extension to autofill a record, right? And when we copy this record UID, that correlates back to that Instagram account that we had. So we're capturing every event that happens, and you can filter on those events either by the record UID, by the user, or by the event type. Now you can create as many of these record reports as you want. You can set the date and the time on those, and you can save that in here to always kind of go back to look at. Now reporting, as great as it is very reactive in nature. Hey, something happened in our environment. Let's go back to the log and figure out the who, what, where, when, and why. Which is why we created the alerting capability, right? This gives you now the ability to get more of a real-time notification when a certain event has occurred. And so using those different event types, you can create an alert that goes to a user via an email address or via an SMS text, or leveraging our webhooks, you have the ability to have that go to plug into Microsoft Teams or to Slack or to ServiceNow whenever a specific event has occurred, right? So for example, I have an alert to notify us when a user gets added to a team. And so what that means is you can see the recipients are set to email Michael Scott whenever this occurs. You can also have it alert the user when it happens. And again, if you want to set an additional recipient, right, this is where you can set up the email, the SMS, or be able to configure the webhook. And so just while we were doing this, we had added Jan to the social media team. And so it did send us that alert while we did it. And so we can see on today's date and time that a user was added to a team. It was Jan. She was added to this specific team. And again, we can correlate that team in the admin console. It was done by the admin, Michael Scott, on today's date and time from the specific IP address, right? So we receive that alert as expected, as is configured. And of course, we can send all these alerts to your SIM, right? So now you can correlate all these Keeper related events to all the other events happening within inside your organization for a larger picture. And we integrate with pretty much any SIM product, right? We have some direct integrations with some of the more common ones, but we also have the syslog push, which can be used to push to your SIM if you don't see their specific logo here. Now, another thing that we have is compliance reports. And again, this is giving you a little more visibility, right? How it differs from reporting alerts is showing you all the activity. Compliance reports is showing you who's got access to what. And so you can generate a compliance report. And it's important to note only a user with the compliance report permission can generate these reports. And what's happening here is it's using a key to ascertain a couple of key pieces of information from the vault. It's encrypting that in its own database, and only the users that have the key to decrypt it have that ability. And so I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of do a organization-wide compliance report. So you can filter first on your users, right? You can narrow that down by what node they're in, or select a specific user, or based on a job title. I'm just going to go ahead and just do everybody. Then you can go ahead and filter what sort of data you're looking at, right? You can correlate that based on a record title. You can do it on a specific record UID, or you can do it again on a job title, or if you're leveraging record types on a specific record type, or via the URL associated in the record. Again, I'm just going to go ahead and just do everything because my vault's not that heavily populated that it's going to take any significant time. Now that the report's generated, right, I can go ahead and see what type of records are inside my user's vault, but I don't get access to the username. I don't get access to the password. I don't get access to any custom fields that are generated. I simply just know the title of the record and the URL of the record and what record it correlates with regards to their UID. But I can see if those records are shared. So for example, if I needed to report to someone who's got access to the Amazon account, I can go ahead and click on that and see that both David Wallace and Michael Scott have edit and share permissions on this account. And so now I'm able to send this to the auditors. I can do a Sarbanes-Oxley report or any other sort of compliance report to kind of say, all right, on this date and time, this is who had access to these key accounts, or this is who had access to everything. And so you can generate it directly here. You can also export that to a CSV, a PDF, or JSON file, right? If I click on the PDF, it'll go ahead and bring up a pretty report that allows me to see the data that was collected in that compliance report, right? So you get to see all the activity, you get to report on who's got the access to those specific accounts. Again, giving you that zero knowledge capability of saying, all right, why does that user have access to the account when they shouldn't have it, right? So you are now able to focus on where zero knowledge may be compromised based on a poor configuration somewhere else. And the last thing that I'll just kind of touch upon before I turn it back over to Tristen to close things out or open up with questions is our secrets manager capability, right? Being able to remove those hard-coded credentials. You'll get to see how your users are doing with regards to that. Again, that's not something you'll deploy organizationally to everyone, but your key developers, DevOps, engineers are definitely candidates for having this capability to remove the compromise of having hard-coded credentials. And so you get to see all those metrics inside of the admin console. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing. And Tristen, I don't know if you had something else that you wanted to say before we close out.
No, just any questions regarding the technical portion of the demonstration? No? Okay. Well, on behalf of Keeper Security, thank you so much for participating. And Haley, I don't know if you wanted to wrap things on behalf of ATARC.
Just want to say thank you all for presenting today, and thanks everyone for attending. This was a really great session.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much.